And for our next segment, it is my honor to turn the floor over to my colleague, Sherry Goodman. She is one of the reasons why the Wilson Center is such a dynamic place. You already heard briefly from her. Sherry is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and also the Polar Institute. She has educated a generation of U.S. military and civilian officials about the nexus between climate change and national security. And I think it's no exaggeration to say she has fundamentally changed the discourse in our country on this topic. Sherry served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Prior to that, on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Sherry has founded, led, or advised nearly a dozen research organizations on environmental and energy matters, national security, and public policy. It's my privilege to turn the floor over to Sherry Goodman.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Let me first thank Ambassador Bolton. It's a pleasure to have him as a colleague, and his great leadership on oceans, Arctic fisheries, and many other diplomatic endeavors over the course of his career are second to none. Let me also thank Pete Ogden of the UN Foundation and Rafe Pomerantz for helping us put this effort together. Both Pete and Rafe, long-serving diplomats and public servants, and I've had the privilege and pleasure to work with both of you. And the last panel, you all were terrific. I met some for the first time. Many of you I've worked with over many years. And Monica, you just did a great job, both moderating that and all your recent work, raising the game and the exposure on climate and environmental issues on the national stage at a time when it is so much needed. So thank you. Thank you deeply. And to my colleagues here at Wilson, because I know Amanda and others who've helped put this together, it doesn't just happen. So thank you very much. Now it's my great privilege to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Kari Asin of Norway. He is a well-known here in Washington, among the think tanks, among government, among diplomats, and many others. And he's so perfectly suited to be here today. Like me, he started his career in the Cold War when we were dealing with the build-down of Russian nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. And we thought that was what was going to consume us across the Arctic. And so he's got that long-serving experience in nuclear weapons, non-proliferation policy, nuclear safety, and has served with distinction in many aspects of Norway's diplomatic service and in Afghanistan. But it's a recognition of his great career and his great judgment and wise counsel that we've now had him here in Washington for 5 years. And I know many of his colleagues back in Norway, and they all speak so highly of him. And I'm privileged to count you as friend, Ambassador, so welcome to the stage.
So good morning, everyone. And a special thanks to David and Sherry and the Wilson Center for organizing this event and to invite me to be here this morning. And what I would like to do is really to give a Norwegian perspective on what we are facing today, and also taking into account the recent report by the IPCC. And I really want to congratulate you and commend you for your work. And as I heard yesterday from a senior European politician, is that everything IPCC has been saying during the last years has been proven to be true. And that is also why I think it's so important to have international actions in addressing the climate changes. The findings of the IPCC report are alarming. And And just to give you a couple of examples, and some of them were also mentioned by the panel. So, but allow me to sort of give you some of the sort of the concerns we see from Norway. First of all is, of course, that the Arctic sea ice is declining every month of the year. Coastal extreme weather events are becoming more severe. Smaller glaciers are protected to lose more than 80% of their current ice mass by the end of this century. Some islands nations are likely to become uninhabitable, and the North Atlantic codstock in the Barents Sea is likely to collapse before the end of this century. We also have data showing that 2014 to 2019 was the warmest 5-year period on record. So there is obvious reason for serious concern. And we should spend our time and resources finding solutions, not wasting time debating the cause of climate change or who is more culpable. We have to speed up our efforts considerably. Political determination from all corners of the world for action at national level and through international cooperation is indeed necessary. We see some positive steps. During the UN Climate Summit last week, many governments committed to action. 65 countries, among them Norway, committing to cutting greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050. And I'm very glad also to see major subnational economies such as California also on that list. 70 countries announced that they will either boost their national action plan by 2020 or have already started the process of doing so. This also includes my country. Although important contributions, these efforts are unfortunately far from enough. But still, let us not lose hope. A lot is actually happening on the ground. The International Energy Agency last week announced they expect renewable capacity additions to grow by almost 12% this year, the fastest pace since 2015, most thanks to solar and wind power. Almost all countries in the world are now working to increase action on climate change. China is launching the world's biggest emission trading system for the power sector. China and India will both phase out the fuel-based cars. South Africa, Chile, Mexico, and Canada are all introducing carbon pricing in their economies, which will drive innovation and transition to clean solutions in energy, industry, and transportation. It will come as no surprise to you that Norway would like to see continued American engagement on climate change. As one of the largest economies and with incredible advances in innovation, the United States' role in driving the world toward low emissions will be significant. So what about Norway? At the national level, we have set ambitious targets. The government's goal is that by 2025, all new cars must have zero emissions or run on biogas. Already today, almost every other new car sold is electric. By 2022, every third coastal ferry will be electric. By 2030, we will cut the climate emissions from shipping and fisheries in half. In 2022, the use of oil to heat buildings will be banned. Almost all electricity in Norway is produced by hydropower. Norway also has available storage for carbon on our continental shelf and 20 years of experience in capturing and storing carbon under the seabed. We will strengthen our contribution under the Paris Agreement. Our current goal is to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030, but that is just a start. Norway will be a low-emission society by 2050, reducing emissions by 90 to 95%. The government has developed an overarching policy strategy for green competitiveness and has substantially increased investments in R&D for climate solutions. However, youth in Norway and in Sweden, like many other places, they are impatient. And we have to admit that they are right, and that the emissions are indeed too high. At the same time, we must continue to emphasize that this is a problem that can be solved. We can limit dangerous climate change by reducing global emissions. The previous panel talked a lot when I came in and heard the last 30 minutes of their discussion. They discussed a lot about related to the Arctic. And Norway, as you all know, is an Arctic country. 10% of the Norwegian population live north of the polar circle. 30% of Norwegian land area is north of the polar circle, and 70% of Norwegian oceans, you find them in the same area. And we are concerned about what is happening in the Arctic. And over the past 50 years, the Arctic's temperature has risen by more than twice the global average. The annual mean air temperature on Svalbard, in the northern, close to the North Pole, in Norway is projected to increase by 7 to 10 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. As the ice melts and energy, minerals, and shipping routes become more accessible, we see increased international interest in the Arctic. Business activity in the Arctic is increasing, including oil and gas exploration, fisheries, tourism, and shipping. As an Arctic coastal state, Norway has a major responsibility for exercising authority and providing monitoring and emergency preparedness in our vast sea areas. Most of the resources and activities in the Arctic fall under the national jurisdictions of the Arctic states. Internationally, the law of the sea, respected by all of the Arctic coastal states, even though not ratified by one of them, regulates rights, and David couldn't do anything about that when he was in the State Department, but let's wait and see. So the law of the sea regulates rights, duties, and responsibilities of states to promote the peaceful use of the ocean and to safeguard environmental considerations. In times of change, our institutions for international cooperation become even more important. The Arctic Council has been vital to finding common solutions to regional challenges. A robust and effective Arctic Council is a major contribution to continued stability in the Arctic, not least in dealing with the consequences of climate change. Let me then give you some Norwegian perspective on ocean. For Norway, the ocean has been the backbone of our country's economy for centuries. It began with fishing, then shipbuilding. It so expanded to oil and gas. Today, however, we discovered that Norwegian waters are exceptionally well adequate for offshore wind. The ocean is a strategic priority area for the Norwegian government. 70% of our national revenues comes from the oceans. And international political leadership is part of that. Last year, the Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg initiated a high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, consisting of 14 heads of government and co-chaired by the President of Palau. Last week in New York, the high-level panel released their very first report on the nexus of the ocean and climate. For the first time, scientists have quantified the contribution the ocean can provide in reducing climate gas emissions. The results are clear. A transition to a sustainable ocean economy will play a significant role in the global response to climate change. Ocean-based climate solutions can deliver up to 1/5 of the annual cut to greenhouse gas emissions needed by 2050 to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is equivalent of taking 2.5 billion cars off the road every year. However, success will require big investments, including in ocean-based renewable energy, such as wind, wave, and solar. And it will require a potential will in a scale that we have not seen so far. 5 years ago, in 2014, Secretary John Kerry initiated the first Over Ocean conference here in Washington, D.C. Since then, Pledges, commitments, and engagements have increased considerably. And I'm pleased to see that his initiative is still alive today. Later this month, the Over Ocean Conference takes place in Oslo. The conference will bring together leaders from governments, businesses, civil society, and research institutions to share their experience, identify solutions, and commit to action for a clean, healthy, and productive oceans. So let me end by saying we need to step up, speed up, and scale up our efforts. This is also the message from young people across the world. But I also think it's important to underline that we all need to remain hopeful. And as Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said in New York last week, the climate emergency is a race we are losing, but it's a race we can win if we change our ways now. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and thank you for Wilson Center for inviting me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was a tour de force and covered so many areas of so much great interest to us and our audience here today. So let me take you on, ask you a few questions to take a deep dive, as this event is called, into some of these areas. So I had the privilege of being back in Oslo just in the last few weeks for NATO's first ever Arctic workshop, where all 29 NATO nations were invited to gather to address the changing Arctic and what it means for NATO's future strategy, plans, and operations. And it was I hadn't been in Oslo in a couple of years, and so I was really struck by the development occurring along the waterfront. The new Opera House and the new Munch Museum that's going up will be open next year. And I had a little bit of a feel like I was in the Netherlands, where the buildings are occurring, the growth is occurring so close to the waterfront, but very integrated. And often we have these discussions about the impacts of climate change and sea level rise and coastal impacts in the U.S. as if it's an either or, like either we can defend or we can retreat. And because of some of the political polarization, we don't see the future. But when I was in Oslo, given the commitments you described, I think I saw what is, a future of a resilient city being developed along a waterfront in a sustainable way. Could you say a little bit more about how you're actually doing this at the sort of local and urban level in Norway?
First of all, I have to say that this year Oslo is the climate capital of Europe, and we are very proud about that. And I think that both the municipality in Oslo, but indeed also the Norwegian government, we are very, very much committed really to play a role and to play a significant role in addressing climate change. And so what you are describing about Oslo, that's right. But I think even not perhaps what is equally important is development happening in the northern part of Norway. And so, for example, if you go to Tromsø, we like to call that the Paris of the North. Economy is booming. There's a vibrant university there. We also will have sort of a students and teachers going to Svalbard to learn more about the Arctic. The coastal, the west coast of Norway is indeed also vibrant. And what I would like to say by this is really that it's a huge difference. And one in the audience has been to Alaska 2 weeks ago. And I've been many times to Alaska. 4% of the Alaskan population, they are Norwegian Americans. But what is striking me is really the difference between Alaska and the northern parts of Norway. It's a totally different societies. And because in Norway, you can't really see any differences in economy, infrastructure, universities, hospitals, education, you can name it, between the south and the north of my country, but that you really can see here in the United States. So it's two totally different societies, and I think that there are many reasons for that. Of course, I think one of the main reasons is the Gulf Stream, which has provided sort of ice-free the northern parts of Norway to be ice-free. So, but to your question about Oslo, I'm from Oslo, but I have to tell you that my mother, she was born in Kirkenes, that is the city next to Russia, at that time the Soviet Union. So, so I have nexus both in the north and the south. So, but Jerry, Oslo has developed a lot during these last couple of years. And to all of you, you should not just go to Oslo, you should go to Norway and go to the west coast and go to the north. Thank you.
Yes. And if you're
That
fortunate
was the
enough, you
promotion
should.
today. David
should-
told me that I can say that. No.
Yeah. If you're fortunate enough, you should go to Svalbard too. One of the most interesting places on the planet, for many reasons. And because you mentioned Kirkenes on the border with Russia, well, let's talk for a minute about how these changes that we're experiencing, the climate changes, are changing the geopolitical situation for Norway and the High North vis-a-vis Russia.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, and I mean, we could have a
whole seminar.
A whole seminar on that, and we have had that in the past.
We have.
But there was one reason I didn't mention that in my remarks, because it's really a comprehensive issue. But I think that just to tell you that we see a lot of Russian military modernization of their nuclear capabilities on the Kola Peninsula. It's not a threat to Norway, but it is a challenge to NATO. Norway knows a lot about that. We like to say that we are the ears and the eyes of NATO in the north, and we are. And what is disturbing, I would say, what's happening on the Kola Peninsula is that with these new nuclear capabilities, strategic capabilities Russia has, is really that they are able to go into the North Atlantic, far into the North Atlantic, and they are could be able, in a given situation, to restrict or to damage the line of communication and maritime transport between North America and Europe. And that's a significant challenge to NATO. But this is being addressed by NATO, and now NATO has set up the new second fleet in Norfolk, down in Virginia, and in sort of addressing that challenge. But as you said, and as I agree with you, we could have another seminar on that. And we should have.
Yes, we should. We'll make that for the next one. But that's an important geopolitical change that's occurred, in our lifetime. At the end of the Cold War, we thought some of that threat had diminished, and now the Greenland ice and UK gap is being re-engaged in an important way. But that brings us to sort of
one issue. I mean, you refer to Russia, but what I really experience in this city is that the attention towards China in the Arctic is much bigger. I mean, everyone in this city is talking about China. As you know, the Arctic Council, they invited China to be an observer to the Arctic Council. They are working sort of as an observer, and I think that we should highlight the possibilities for working with China in the Arctic, rather than trying to sort of create creating a view that is purely sort of out of strategic reasons why China is in the Arctic.
Okay, that definitely takes a whole nother seminar, because there's a lot to unpack in the Chinese Polar Silk Road in the Arctic, and so let me take that opportunity of China in the Arctic and in its declaration of being a near Arctic stakeholder, on which the U.S. has called its bluff. And others, but China is an observer in the Arctic Council. So let's talk about the implications of the IPCC report for Arctic governance, of which, the Arctic Council is really the centerpiece. Yeah. And can you reflect for us, Ambassador, on Norway's thinking on how we, just as you're climate-proofing Norway, how do we, in some ways, climate-proof our governance institutions in this age?
I really think that I think a lot has happened these recent years when it comes to sort of an improved political understanding and a commitment to address the climate changes. But I think I think there is really a need for scientists and like the IPCC to feed into international and multilateral institutions and arenas what is happening. And I think that because, for example, the government of Norway, we are not able to do that by ourselves. And I really think, but what we can do is really to take, in this case, the recent IPCC report, to bring it into the Arctic Council, but indeed also in our ocean conference, which we are chairing, as I said, later this month, and to have that really as a basis for political discussions about the way forward. And there is why I think that IPCC is really a key in sort of for politicians to elaborate policy goals and commitments, really.
Right. Right. So the science in many ways undergirds the development of strengthened governance institutions and what in the Cold War and the nuclear age we call confidence-building measures in arms control, but in many ways these strengthened science-to-action elements, whether it's working groups of the Arctic Council, the IPCC report feeding into various forums, including the upcoming Our Oceans Conference, also help to build confidence in a time which is also fraught with geopolitical tension.
Yeah, you said it very eloquently. But also I would say that I think that the discussions and sort of commitments and policy developments within the framework Arctic Councils is very important.
Yes.
But it's really important also to broaden it internationally, to have a sort of a joint international efforts behind what we are going to achieve. I mean, Arctic Council can't address the climate changes in the Arctic by themselves.
Right. Okay, I think it's time to open the floor to questions. Okay, I see Amanda's got the mic, and I see a hand in the back, and then we'll go to the woman in the front. Yeah, thank you, Jack. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks again for being here. So, I know refugees in general is a huge political issue worldwide, and climate refugees are probably going to be the next big thing. So I guess my question is, what are the implications maybe of climate refugees, and how does the science of this report, for instance, sort of inform the way that governments are going to approach this kind of impending wave of people, especially, from countries like Bangladesh, for instance, that are going to be very affected by climate change and are very densely populated?
Thank you for that question. And I think I will start by saying that the climate refugees is an issue which, in the case of my government, we have been discussing for quite a long time. And I think that the answer to the question is, of course, that in order for that not to happen, and I think if it were to happen, we are talking about hundreds of millions of people might be leaving their countries in sort of searching refuge other places. But the answer to it is, of course, that we have to not just to address the climate changes, but we have to sort of to fix it, and to make it sort of, and to reduce the emissions, and that's a huge task. But I must say that I really think that the voice of the youths, the voice of the children, I think that, and I can see that in my own country, and I think I'm not speaking on behalf of Europe, but I think that those voices are being understood by politicians. And in the case of Norway, we just had local elections a month ago, 3 weeks ago, and we really saw there that the Norwegian youths, they aligned behind those political parties addressing the climate changes the strongest. And it was, I would say, a significant political shift in political opinions in Norway. And that is being understood by those parties who have been ruling Norway since the end of the Second World War.
That was insightful, and maybe we'll see
Don't tweet me.
that affecting the U.S. In a different way. Takes, we're a much bigger country, but we have our own, we have climate migration occurring already in the U.S. and relocation of villages from Louisiana to Alaska, and the migration into our own country that we have dealt with in a very bad way in recent years. I will just say, as the daughter of Holocaust refugees who were privileged enough to come to this country, that we should not treat people this way. It makes me so sad and despairing, as I know many of you are. And we also know that some of the migration is exacerbated by climate impacts being felt in other parts of the world. And that will probably continue to be the case. Hopefully, governance will be more humane and tolerant, but we also have to recognize that that is happening, and so resilience has to occur at the local level to help people where they are living today. Okay, I think we had a question here and in the back, and Dave's going to tell me when. That's it? Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much for your presentation and discussion. It's been wonderful to hear. Can you tell me about any potential for an increased role between IPCC and either the Arctic Council or the Antarctic Treaty System, either sending invited observers or some other participants? And also, is there a way for those two intergovernmental organizations and international organizations to see best practices or to share best practices about mitigations and adaptations, and a way for that information to be disseminated either through a special report or things like that? Thank you.
Was that to Chair or to me? I think that
might be a
David.
Dave or a first panel question answer.
So when the United States last chaired the Arctic Council, we did just that. We brought somebody from the IPCC to present what was then the latest assessment report. And then it was debated among the Arctic Council countries, and particularly with input from the scientific parts of the council, particularly the so-called AMAP working group. And the Arctic Council actually did a number of things on climate as a direct result of what the IPCC was saying to us. And I don't see any reason, at least in principle, why that type of interaction can't continue. At least I feel like it should. I don't know whether anybody from the IPCC has ever gone to one of the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. I will say that in the United States, we did host once, I don't think it's ever happened again, a joint meeting of the Arctic Council and the Antarctic Treaty parties, particularly to talk about common experiences related to climate change. And there again, that was back in the 50th anniversary of the Arctic Council, which was some years ago. It suggests to me that the time may be right to try to do that again.
Let me also say that the IPCC has been invited to participate and to give their assessment and views on our ocean conference in Norway in 3 weeks' time.
For Antarctica, Bill Muntean with State Department, work on Antarctica affairs. So there is an annual meeting for Antarctica Treaty members. It's not the same as the Arctic Council. IPCC, I don't believe, has been invited to participate in recent times, but there is a standing agenda item working on climate change issues. Antarctica, it's not the source of the climate change, it's where it's reflected. And so the Antarctic treaties focus on peace and science is its largest contribution to addressing climate change. So much of what we learn, whether it's Thwaites or other activities that are demonstrating the effect of climate change over time, are due to the Antarctic treaties setup that has been in place. It's something that we discuss, how best to continue the science, how to continue the peace, and how to continue to keep Antarctica out of a lot of the same geopolitical currents that the North is facing.
Okay, last question. You can have a comment.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks for your comments. And I just wanted to probe a little more on this commitment to carbon neutrality that you mentioned, that your country and 60 other countries or some number committed to. applaud that. I'm interested in what it means in terms of the fossil fuel industry in Norway, but also the IPCC reports clearly call for negative emissions, that we not only have to decarbonize, but we have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We're at dangerous levels now. So how does carbon neutrality relate to that part of the scientific findings around negative emissions? So I appreciate any comments you have.
I think that what Norway as you refer to as a sort of a country with a huge production of oil and gas. While that is happening, and which also contributes, I would say, to a significant part of our national revenues, is really that we are trying to do two things at the same time. Is to have a production or extraction of oil and gas to be as clean as possible. We see that there is better for European countries to spend to use gas from the North Sea rather than coal. But at the same time, I think that that we are trying, and that was part of what I tried to say. Also, try to sort of to drive together with the European Union and others, the international sort of commitment to address climate change and to lower the emissions. But I must be so honest to say that Norway is not going to sort of to stop the production of oil and gas in the foreseeable future. But we are, as I said, we are trying to do as best as we can in order to lower the emissions. And one of the things we are doing, and I refer to that also, is what we call the carbon capture storage. So that will be the situation in the future. What I didn't mention also is that because we see the sort of the climate changes worldwide, we are also having, I would say, a strong Norwegian commitment to deforestation. And where we are working with many countries. I didn't have time to speak about that, but that's one of the things we are doing internationally. But thank you for your question.
Okay, let's give Ambassador Aas a big round of applause.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thanks very much as well from me to Ambassador Asin and to Sherry Goodman. It's now my honor to introduce one of my favorite people, Rafe Pomerantz. Rafe has had an extraordinary career both in government and the non-governmental sector. He's currently chairman of Arctic 21, a network of organizations focused on communicating the unraveling of the Arctic as a result of climate change. Rafe is also a senior fellow for Arctic policy at the Woods Hole Research Center, also a consultant to the nonprofit Rethink Energy Florida, which seeks to raise awareness of the impact of sea level rise in that state. Rafe has spent much of his career raising awareness about climate change, building support for climate solutions. Many of you may know his work plays a central role in an extraordinary article that came out in the New York Times Magazine over the summer and a subsequent book, Losing Earth. And as I understand it, that article and book are in the process of being transformed into a full-length documentary. Rafe Pomerantz, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dave. One of my great friends. Also, we have one other thing in common. We were both Deputy Assistant Secretaries of State in OES. So, and I actually have one or two historical notes to share. My notes here as listening get longer and longer, so I got to cut them out here. Thank you, Ambassador Left. Great talk, inspiring. I want to thank our team that put this together. This was amazing because we were putting this together while the IPCC report was reaching its final stage. And we had Dave, Marisol Maddox from here at the Wilson Center, and Justin Kinney and Monica Dean from UN Foundation who helped to do this. And I have to say a word about Monica, who has been instrumental in creating the PR around these IPCC reports. It's kind of a hidden role, but the IPCC is now a new organization. It's world famous, and Monica had a lot to do with that. The content, yes, but good media work always helps. And okay, now history quickly. And I should thanks for a terrific panel. I thought it was really, it's hard to come up with a compelling panel these days in the climate field because it's all compelling, but this panel was just super. And maybe, I don't know, super is the right word, but really compelling and can drive. I think it has, the findings can drive urgency and high ambition, which are the diplomatic terms that will be used in Chile. These findings, because we get away from kind of the global temperature indicator down to specific parts of the climate system that people can relate to. And I think in that is the power. Now, as we were going on here, something Mark said about the oceans and these heat waves, and I remembered a talk I heard. Anybody remember Carl Wunsch, a very famous oceanographer from MIT, co-author of the Charney Report? And I remember as in my first few naive years, he said, the oceans have their own weather. We just don't know anything about it. Now we know a lot about it. That was about 35 years ago. A second is that we just are on top of the first meeting of the IPCC in Geneva was almost 31 years ago. It was the day after the 1988 presidential election. And so that's how long the IPCC has been around. Final historic point is that it was, I think, 25 years ago that at the State Department, along with our colleagues at NOAA, we launched something called the International Coral Reef Initiative, which was designed to track the bleaching. And it was recently used by a member of the National Security Council to defend uncertainty about climate change. That was the first time ICRI got any attention in a couple of decades. The most ludicrous thing I've ever seen. But it just tells you, because back then we were picking up in the satellite data these warm temperature that would, as these small blobs would cross the reefs, we'd get bleaching episodes. That leads me to missed diplomatic opportunities. I was trying to think, well, how do you talk about the occupant of the White House? And I was thinking about two missed opportunities. Today you may have seen, well, the opportunity was we were talking to Australia. Did you notice on the front page of the papers today? I can't remember what that was about. But what it should have been was a conversation about bleaching. Because bleaching is taking out Australia and the world's great asset, the Great Barrier Reef. And this is a true crisis, and they're waking up to it in Australia. That should have been the topic. And the second lost opportunity, you may recall, we were thinking for a moment about buying Greenland. Anybody remember that? Brief. Maybe we should have bought the Greenland ice sheet. But what I wanted to say was that then, when that idea sort of went down the tubes, the president canceled his trip to Denmark. And I wrote an op-ed piece. It was published in Florida. I'll get to that in a minute. And I suggested, as a former diplomat, that the president use this window in his schedule to go to Greenland and do what so many other politicians have done and look at the ice sheet, because that's where our real security issue is. Greenland, as we have heard from Rob, Greenland is going to take out cities all over the world, combined with the other land ice. And that was a moment when we should have been shining the light, or darkness, or cold, on Greenland because of its relation to the fate of the United States. And so that was another missed opportunity. So back to Arctic 21. As Dave mentioned, we established ourselves in 2014 to support a decision by the State Department to make climate change in the Arctic a focus of the U.S. chairmanship. And John Kerry and the president made that decision, which I think helped propel climate change in the Arctic as a visible issue. So our goal has been to communicate the unraveling of the Arctic, and by that we meant the loss of Greenland, the high latitude glaciers, sea ice, the thawing permafrost, and the loss of spring snow cover. Plenty to document the unraveling. The second thing, the policy part, was to ask two questions, so they're sort of the same, which is, what is the Arctic that's required to sustain the global climate system? Because the Arctic is, as Michael mentioned, we're thawing the permafrost, which will become an enormous feedback of carbon dioxide and methane. We're thawing Greenland, or shrinking it, and the high latitude glaciers, which mean much more sea level rise. And we're losing the sea ice, which is a big feedback to the global climate system in terms of warming. So those are connections to the global climate system, and increasingly it looks like the excess warming in the Arctic is tied to a vast shift in mid-latitude weather. So there is a connection, but the question for governments is, what is the Arctic we have to sustain the global climate system? We need a number. We need a number. What is the allowable temperature increase in the Arctic that we as a world can allow? And it's probably buried somewhere in that blue line, and that we saw earlier. So now we're coming up on the Chilean COP this year, and I know that the Chileans are going to have a big pavilion on the cryosphere. Chile has a very massive glaciers, but also strong ties to the fate of Antarctica. So it'll be a big topic, and this report can help drive the outcome there, because, as we heard, such a compelling panel, and the findings of this report, I think, can help drive the commitments that we need. One or two final points here. How do we do this in the United States? We remain the most important country in this struggle, and yet we're totally, at least at the national level, we are stuck. And as a former negotiator, we're going to need bipartisan help. If you want to be a U.S. negotiator in the future, you need the implementing legislation before you go to the negotiations. What can a negotiator promise to deliver from the U.S.? Not much, unless the Congress has already acted, and that requires a bipartisan strength that we don't have and we have to achieve. Well, one way to get there is through geography. What do I mean by geography? Well, U.S. politics and policies driven by geography. Where do members of Congress come from? So let me give you one example of how to do this. And that's to focus on a place that brings this report together, the pieces together. Now, I was going to ask, who wants to guess where that is? Okay, nobody. So Florida. The answer is Florida. Well, why is that? How can you talk about the ice sheets in a hot place like Florida? Well, the answer is simple. That we boiled it down in Arctic 21 to a one-liner. Maybe you've heard this, maybe not. That the fate of Greenland is the fate of Miami, or Jacksonville, or Tampa, or Naples, you name it. It's the fate of the whole state. Sea level rise is an existential threat to Florida, and that has to drive the politics. And once the politics of Florida changes in a grandiose fashion, everything changes, because Florida is a critical state in our elections. It's a critical part of the U.S. economy. Can we afford to let Florida go, so to speak? And so I think focusing on geography, where there are impacts, can help move the U.S. toward the bipartisan consensus that we need. I know it feels impossible, but we got to get there in order to make it to the blue line, And so keep your eye on impacts in Florida. In fact, in order to demonstrate that we're active in this, we asked Michael to give a press conference on the web last, when was it? Thursday, the day after the report. It was all Florida media. That was the point of it, to drive home the connection between ice and the fate of Florida. And let me say, Florida's also experienced massive coral bleaching. So we were able to bring that element of the report in. So I think what we've got here in this panel was a terrific summation of the climate elements of the climate system that can drive the ambition that we need. And so I want to thank the scientific panel, the authors who came to convey that. And I hope they keep it up because I think it can really move the system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rafe. And that brings us to the end of our program. What's left for me to do is to thank first my partners, the UN Foundation, Arctic 21, my colleagues at the Wilson Center, particularly Marisol Maddox, Amanda King, Lauren Reesey, Jack Durkee, others who helped put this panel together and made it run flawlessly. Let me thank all of our speakers for coming and for excellent presentations. And finally, all of you for your attention, your questions, and your ongoing concern about these issues. Thanks very much. Take care.